hopefully you enjoyed that video and his explanation of how work samples could be implemented in a business setting. My best example of a work sample is the sort of the hoops that they put us through when we're applying to be professors, right? You're brought in to interview for the job, and in addition to your biodata that you provided on your Vita, and then your interview experience and those kinds of things, we generally give a lecture on either a subject that the department has decided that everybody has to give a lecture on that same subject. Oftentimes when we're trying to hire somebody who is going to teach research methods, we'll ask them to give a lecture on some aspect of research methods, so that they're all sort of on the same basic topic. Sometimes they accidentally all end up on the exact same topic. We had 3 candidates and they all lectured on correlation does not establish causation. It's like, wow, guys are all on the same exact page. So that was really kind of convenient, because it was easier to sort of compare them to each other because they had different styles of delivering the information, right? So if what you're going to be doing at work is conveying information to listeners, it's a really easy jump to say, well, let's have them convey information to listeners. We try and get students to come in and sit in on these lectures so we can get a student perspective. We like to have like the staff in the office listen to it, so we have sort of more of a layperson's attitude about the information, because all of us who have degrees in the exact same thing that the person who's giving the talk have, a lot of times we sort of know what they mean by it, even if they didn't say it. So it's kind of nice to hear from students and from staff about how this work sample actually went for the types of people who would actually experience this information in a real job setting, right? So you can think of lots of different kinds of jobs where it would make a lot of sense to ask the candidate to actually just demonstrate, how would you exactly do this job? Like, show me how you're going to do it. So work samples, kind of time consuming, but really worthwhile. So we're going to duplicate performance criteria measures and then use them as predictors. So we're going to try and predict how, for example, a professor might be in the classroom based on how they performed in the work sample that they gave. Now, there are specific examples of work samples that you can administer in certain settings, like a situational judgment test. It's a paper and pencil test, or there are video scenarios where you actually have the candidate watch a little video and then they give their responses to that. So it could be written vignette, kind of little story, or it could be a video scenario. And then you want to measure the applicant's judgment as they're solving the problem that was, provided either in the written story or in the video scenario. These are usually going to be scored by subject matter experts. So, the HR department isn't necessarily going to score this. They might bring in supervisors or other people who really know what the answers should be. These kinds of situational judgment tests account for about 25% of the variance in performance on the job. And, when we do these work samples where we have professors give a guest lecture, I can observe why these might not be better predictors just from watching people do their work sample, giving a guest lecture. You got to factor in that they're nervous while talking in front of peers at a degree that they wouldn't be if it was just students. Sometimes we assign them to talk about a particular topic and maybe this isn't their best topic. And so they had to prepare something fresh for us. And so they're a little bit like anxious about that because it's the first time they've really lectured on it. We might get swayed by personality, right? Like some people are really engaging while they deliver a talk and other people are not, but maybe the material's better and the person who was not that engaging. But then we have to kind of say, well, how are our students going to learn from somebody who's not that engaging? So you kind of have to balance it. I could see where with a work sample, we could end up with faulty judgments because maybe we are being swayed by information that's not relevant, or maybe they're behaving in a way that's not normal for how they would behave if they were in a classroom. Maybe they are coming out at their best and really in a classroom, maybe they would be angry, or maybe they would be short-tempered with their students. Maybe they really, really prepared for the work sample, and the truth is they're kind of procrastinators and they're just always behind when it's time to really be performing in the classroom. There are a lot of factors that you really can't tap into with a work sample. So I could see where, even though we've asked you to do exactly what you would do on the job, it's not a perfect match. And so we still are at about 25% of variance. How about assessment centers? These are usually used by really big corporations. Microsoft uses them. Google uses them. In assessment centers, we have multiple raters evaluate applicants, or actually we can use assessment centers to determine who should be being promoted. So sometimes we'll use them on incumbents, on a standardized set of predictors that simulate the job that they are applying for. So we have multiple different kinds of predictors that can be included in an assessment center. Normal things like you might expect interviews in any kind of job situation. And then we've got those psychometric tests that I've been talking about that are, either cognitive ability tests or psychomotor tests or any of these tests I've been talking about so far. So those are kind of normal things. And then we add in there group exercises. I saw a really great example of that from Microsoft where they were trying to figure out how people would work together in a team. And so they gave them a bunch of dry spaghetti and marshmallows, and they told them to build as tall of a tower as they could with the marshmallows and spaghetti. And so they were using them kind of like Tinker Toys kind of thing and building towers. And the key thing is they were observed through the whole group exercise so that the evaluators could get some insight into who worked well in a group, who emerged as a leader in a group, these kinds of things, who was problematic in the group. In-basket exercises. These are tests where you actually, it's for managers usually. You give them a series of things that are in their pretend in-basket, and they're supposed to prioritize and solve the problems in the in-basket. There are social situations in these assessment centers where maybe we want to see how people interact and get along, and how they talk and how they engage. And we might ask the candidates to give a presentation of some sort of job talk or a presentation of data or something like that. Usually these assessment centers last 2 to 3 days because we have a lot of things that we want to go through. Typically used by large companies that have the money to be putting into candidates. They're super expensive. Time is money, right? So we're taking people away from what they could be doing that might be generating revenue for the company and instead putting them into this assessment center. But what they're trying to do is avoid hiring somebody who turns out not to work out, because whenever you hire a new employee, you're investing a lot into them. And so they're trying to make good choices so that in the long run, it'll cost them less, right? Because they made a good choice. Even with all these different ways of looking at things and all the stuff that's going on, as a conglomeration, our assessment centers only account for 14 to 20% of the variance in performance on the job. So adding more things, doing all these, because what starts to happen over the 2 to 3 days is that the observers start to get to know the applicants, and then we start to get bias introduced. And so we still are not necessarily making clear, objective decisions, even though it looks on the face of it like, wow, this should be a really good opportunity for making clear, objective decisions. So it does account for some of the variance, but not as much as even some of the other tests we've talked about. What about that biodata I keep talking about, biographical information? The reason why we ask people about their past jobs and other kinds of things that they've done before we meet them is because we assume that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So for example, if you have a job history that looks like you work for about 6 months at a time and you hop around and have lots of different jobs, it looks like you might be the kind of person who will work here for like 6 months, right? Because that's what you've always done. That's all you've ever done. And it looks like that's what you do. That's why it's important oftentimes in your biographical information to give context. So make it really clear that, yeah, I had a different job every summer while I worked my way through high school and college. And so, yeah, I have a lot of things on my Vita, but notice they're all between June and September, right? While I was earning money to pay for the school year, whatever. Having an explanation for why your behavior could be misinterpreted, right? Have the favorable interpretation also embedded in that biographical information. So it's really clear. Now, for a lot of places, application blanks are the way that they accrue the biographical information. Today, a lot of companies have those online, right? Where you go onto their website and you fill in your name and your age and whatever else they ask about. Date of birth is usually what they ask, not age. So they ask a bunch of stuff on an application blank. Biodata questionnaires are a little bit better designed. They'll have multiple choice items where, there's a range of possible responses and you have to pick one, right? They tend to have broad questions that allow people to you could use this biodata questionnaire, could be used by lots of different kinds of fields and companies, right? There tends to be a lot of different questions asked in the same broad area so that we can get a little bit more detail drilled down through the biodata questionnaire. Application blanks are oftentimes very standard, and they aren't necessarily that informative. In fact, a lot of lawsuits have implied that they really are just a way to get demographic information so that biased decisions can be made. So application blanks are not really advisable anymore. Instead, we want to use these biodata questionnaires. A lot of companies, even ones that aren't hiring you into a very prestigious position, will ask these days for resumes so that you can offer yourself in your best light in a way that, that way they don't even have to generate a biodata questionnaire. They just ask you to tell us all the things that would be relevant. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't tailor their resumes to the job that they're applying to, and so they shoot themselves in the foot. It's like if you had tailored it to this particular position and made it really clear how your previous experience ties into what you perceive to be, the job now, that's going to be a lot more helpful than if you just have a standard resume and you just, no matter what kind of job you're applying for, you send the same thing. Anyway, this isn't a resume writing class. Biodata questionnaires account for about 10 to 27% of the variance. So you can imagine that some biodata questionnaires are probably better, maybe more relevant to the job, maybe asking the kinds of questions that need to be asked, and others are probably not as good. Application blanks, we don't even really have data on how much the stuff that's collected on an application blank actually predicts behavior, because we're pretty much assuming not very good. So biodata questionnaires are sort of the wave of the future, although they've been around for a really long time. So what we're going to do is go back to our automotive body and related repairers sheet. And what we're going to try and think about is some biodata questions that we could generate that would address the case-outs of the automotive job. So let's go back to that. I don't think we can deal with all the case-outs, so let's just do the case and just kind of think about what kinds of questions we could ask on a biodata questionnaire that would help us to know whether this applicant has the knowledge that we think is critical. And we have decided that these 5 things that were offered by ONET are critical qualities for our mechanic or our automotive repairer to have. So we could think about, for example, how could we ask them something that would reveal their knowledge of machines and tools, including their designs, uses, repair, and maintenance? Well, one really simple thing is we could ask them what training they have. Maybe they went to Universal Technical Institute and they got diesel training, or they got auto body repair training, or they have actually a certificate from their local community college, or so maybe what we need to do is ask a question about where they got their training. And it's possible that they might say something like, as an apprentice working for an auto body repairer, or they might say something like, I graduated in whatever year from this technical institute, or whatever, right? But you can imagine you could ask how they know, and we could let training could be the stand-in for what they know. Because we see how it's a stand-in? We have to assume that if they went through the training, they actually gained the knowledge. Maybe to establish that they've gained the knowledge, we could ask them whether they've had any jobs in this field before, right? Like maybe we sort out people who haven't got the experience by putting it on our job advertisement. We say that you need at least 2 years in this field before we'll even look at you, because we realize that a lot of times people go through school and they come out and they don't know as much as we would like. And so maybe we want people who have learned on the job. So you can imagine writing a biodata question that asks about previous work experience in this field. What about English language? Knowledge of the structure and content of the English language, including the meaning and spelling of words, rules of composition, and grammar. It's possible we wouldn't even have to ask a specific question about that. Maybe we could ask them to write a little statement about their career goals and their passion for this field. And in that, we could analyze whether they use English correctly and things like that. Customer and personal service. Knowledge of principles and processes for providing customer and personal services. This includes customer needs assessment, meeting quality standards for services, and evaluation of customer satisfaction. Maybe we could generate a question where we describe a customer who comes in and tells us this about their vehicle. Insert whatever the customer has said. I don't know, it's making this weird wop, wop, wop sound when I get up to 45 miles an hour. And then we have maybe even a multiple choice set of answers that the person could choose for how they would use this customer's information to assess the needs of the customer. Like, does it sound like it's an alignment problem? Does it sound like they might have, something loose on the body of the car? What follow-up questions would you ask this customer? Maybe one of the choices would be, have you been in an accident lately? Have you hit a pothole? Right? I mean, you can imagine writing questions that would allow the person to reveal how they would handle problems. Sometimes those questions are easy to write because you've had previous employees who have done the wrong things. And so you can use those as distractors. And they seem believable because somebody's done it before. And so you can have those as distractors. Like, I don't want to see an applicant saying yes to this one. So you can imagine writing questions that could get at these different knowledges that could take different kinds of forms. I've argued so far for a multiple choice question or two. I've argued in favor of a simple question where they're supposed to tell us about their training. And then I've got that English language one. I had an open-ended question that they'd have to write a response to that would give us access to that information. So different styles of questions might appear on our biodata questionnaire. All right, well, hopefully that helped to illustrate, like, you would just go through your case hours and generate items and what you might find is that some of those items could tap into, let's say, a knowledge aspect and then also a skills aspect, right? Like one item might hit a couple of your goals. All right, what about interviews? This is among the most popular of all the selection devices. It's almost like if you don't interview a candidate, you have not done your duty. Like, none of these other things that we've talked about so far truly will take the place of an interview. I mean, almost every job type involves an interview of some sort. Like, it's hard to imagine hiring somebody without actually interviewing them. So there are different ways that we could do interviews. Unstructured would be where you just sort of have a conversation with each applicant and there's no consistent questioning or anything. You just sort of whatever seems pressing while talking to this person, and it sort of goes whatever direction it goes with this particular candidate. The problem with this strategy is that, I talked about, let's imagine I'm hiring that person to be an auto body repair person. So this person came in and I noticed what car they drove up in. And so I started talking to them about that car and did you do the repairs on it yourself? And how long have you had it? And next thing you know, we pretty much talked about the car the whole time. And I never really asked anything about their work history or anything like that because, hey, they said that they worked on the car themselves. And it looks really good. So I feel like I have all the information I need. And then somebody else comes in and right before they got here, I had gotten a delivery from UPS with an incorrect, object that I had ordered, they didn't deliver what I needed, and so I had to send it back. And so I'm thinking about that thing. And so that caused me to talk about service, customer service kinds of things with this applicant, because it was top of my mind. Like, what would you do if a client came in and said that after your repair, it's still making the same noise? What would you do, right? Because maybe I'm disgruntled with how the company who sent me the object handled my complaint, right? So instead of talking about these kinds of repair questions that I talked about with the first candidate, this candidate, I'm talking about customer service things. Okay, so now I've got completely different information from the two different people, because I didn't plan. I didn't make sure I hit on all topics with both candidates. Now I'm supposed to decide. Am I supposed to assume that because that person repaired their own car and it looks really nice, that they also will be good at customer service? Am I supposed to assume that because this person gave really good answers about how they would handle customer service, that they'd also be good at repairing? So obviously we need to do a structured interview, because we don't want to have these crazy, completely uncomparable interviews. Structured interview. So we're going to have standardized questions that are generated out of job analysis information, right? So we're going to be very specific, asking all candidates questions that relate specifically to aspects of the job. Wow, that's novel. So one of the benefits of this strategy is that it increases our reliability. We should be able to produce the same kinds of information from every candidate, and that'll allow us to make fairer comparisons between candidates. So a behavior description interview is when interviewees describe ways in which they have addressed past situations. So if you're in an interview, I don't know if Facebook listens while I'm giving these lectures or what while I'm searching for things while I'm preparing my slides or whatever. But across my Facebook feed, I just this morning, literally, I got a how to score on those interview questions. And it had those interview questions like, why are you leaving your current job? And then it told you how you're supposed to answer the question. And actually it was a pretty vague advice that they gave, because it was saying things like, be specific, but make sure that you're not trashing your previous company, because, that may look worse to the employer. And it gave some kind of vague advice, I have to say. But in it also talked about a common interview question is something like, have you ever experienced this on the job, and how did you handle it? And again, they gave very vague advice. They were like, give an example that's specific enough that it shows that you actually had a problem like it, but is vague enough that you're not being pinned down and expected to be able to handle that specific thing here at this job. I'm like, that's helpful. But the idea with this behavior description interview is that, for example, if you're applying to be a waitress at my diner, I might ask, when you worked at your previous employer, what did you do when a customer was dissatisfied with the food? And then the server would then explain how they took it back to the kitchen or comped the person, or however they handled it, right? And that's the insight you're supposed to be gaining from this kind of question is, insight about how they typically solve these kinds of problems, or how they typically prioritize tasks during the day, things like that. So you want to just kind of get an insight into that. Now, of course, they may have pre-prepped answers for these kinds of things, because they've been scrolling Facebook also, and they saw, what to do in these interview questions. So it's not a perfect design, but the idea is that, hopefully they'll give an answer that gives you enough information to decide whether they're actually able to handle the situations that they might encounter on the job. The situational interview is where you give specific dilemmas, specific situations, and the person is supposed to describe, for this situation, what would they do? So instead of looking back in the past when I've had similar situations, in this one, literally, this is your dilemma. What do you do? And this can be kind of tricky, because they might think that they have to give an answer that's very specific to the structure of this job, and they may not know enough about exactly, what is the hierarchy here and things like that. But what you're looking for overall is, for example, maybe you're really concerned about whether they have an orientation towards customer service. Like, is the goal in their solution really to make sure that the customer leaves happy? If that aligns with the company goals, then that's what we're looking for. So we're looking for something that hopefully they don't have a pat answer to, right? Because we're giving them the dilemma or the situation right now. Sometimes applicants will say, oh yeah, see, actually something just like this happened to me at work, and this is what I did. But sometimes it's a brand new thing that they have never heard of before, and they're going to have to, on the fly, figure out a solution right there. And so it gives a little bit of insight into their thinking process and into their basic approach to things. So unstructured interviews account for about 11% of the variance in performance on the job. So it's accounting for something, but it's not super accurate. The structured interviews account for about 44% of variance. So unstructured interviews probably should not be used. Instead of all the things we've talked about so far, this is the largest amount of variance that's been accounted for by any of the things we've talked about when we talk about the structured interview. So having really good job analysis based questions that are asked of every candidate, this seems to produce the best predictive ability of all the things individually that we've talked about so far. Now, if you're ever conducting an interview, there are a lot of things that you're not allowed to ask. How old are you? That's why I corrected my Biodata thing. A lot of times they'll ask about a birthday instead of age. And I'm sorry, we can do the math, so I'm not sure why birthday's okay. Have you ever been arrested? No, you're not allowed to ask that. Do you plan on having children? Are you pregnant? No. Are you a U.S. citizen? Not allowed to ask that. Do you have a disability? Not allowed to ask that. Do you have any children? Do you need daycare? Is your daycare taken care of? Are you actively involved in the NAACP? Have you ever been treated by a psychologist or a psychiatrist? Have you ever been hospitalized? For what? How many days were you absent from work due to illness in the past year? Are you taking any prescribed drugs? We are not allowed to ask anything even close to these things. So I'm going to make another argument for the structured interview on the basis of we rarely end up accidentally asking things that are illegal when we stick to the script of the structured interview. So when people start freewheeling is when they start asking stuff they shouldn't ask. All right. So estimates of validity coefficient. So from the best on the top to the worst predictors, I am going to give us a list. So general cognitive ability, psychomotor ability is below that on ability to predict, assessment centers, and then biodata. The strict, scales. Even biodata questions aren't as good as the others. Here's the thing I want to leave you with, though. So you might say to yourself, well, if 44% of the variance is accounted for by structured interviews, why am I doing anything else? The more things you put together, the more variance will be accounted for. Now, it's not a simple adding thing. So if I tell you that general cognitive ability accounts for 25% of the variance and, structured interviews account for 44%, you can't sum those and say, well, 69% of the variance will be accounted for by my combination of general cognitive ability and structured interview. That's not how it works. It's still going to be somehow weighted and it's imprecise and things like that. All we can say is the more things that you do, the more you boost your predictive capability. Some predictors are going to be more useful than others in predicting certain criteria. So you definitely want to tailor to what you're hiring, right? Like psychomotor ability might be a super important measurement for somebody who's doing something that involves fine motor skills or gross motor skills, right? It's hard to imagine that you're going to hire, let's say, a football quarterback without making sure that his psychomotor skills are up to par, right? AKA they have like the quarterback combine or whatever. You want to make sure that they have the physical skills because that's really super important for the job. So you want to make sure for your job which things you're emphasizing. certain assessment center things that I mentioned were, altogether assessment centers aren't much better than any of these individual tests, but for certain jobs, they're critical, right? Like if you need people who can work together and be part of the company team, you could see where those group tasks and those socializing tasks would be really, really informative. Like, how is this person fitting in? Now, of course, over a course of 2 or 3 days, a person could fake getting along. A person could fake being able to be part of the group. You could see where, even an assessment center could be manipulated on that. But I'm just making the argument that, if you tailor your predictors to the kind of job that you're hiring, you're going to get better predictive ability. All right. So that concludes chapter 6. Hopefully I've given you good information that if you're ever in a hiring situation and you get to make decisions, or if you're ever being hired and you want to make sure to present yourself in the best light possible, hopefully you've got some, concrete ideas that would really help you out in either situation. All right. I will see you back here for chapter 7.